Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be going through part 2 of microeconomics. If you guys haven't watched part 1 already, I recommend you do so because I'm going in the order of the syllabus guide and it'll help you to understand part 1 before you watch part 2. Without further ado, let's get started. So in this section, we're all looking at market failure and government intervention in the market, right? So reasons for government intervention in the market can be for revenue. As you know, governments have to spend money, and if they want to spend money, they have to earn money. That's government revenue. Government revenue can be through indirect taxes, such as GST in Australia, value-added tax VAT in the UK, and it can also be through progressive income taxes, like in many countries. They can support firms. So in terms of supporting firms, you may recall that a subsidy will reduce the cost of production for firms, thereby supporting them as they earn more revenue. Support households on low incomes. This is also done through subsidies generally, because if you subsidize a product, it generally lowers the price of the product, and if the product is lower priced, then lower income households can buy it cheaper, supporting them. Influence the level of production. So again, subsidies generally, or taxes. If you implement a tax, you will reduce the amount of production. If you implement a subsidy, you can increase the level of production. We'll be looking at that in terms of externalities. Next, we have influence the level of consumption, because just by changing production activity, you can alter consumption. For instance, if you implement a tax, you will reduce production and generally increase price, because some of the tax burden will be implemented on the consumer, and because of that higher price, quantity demanded will fall and consumption will decrease. Vice versa, if you add a subsidy. Correct market failure. Market failure is the inability to maximize social welfare. So social welfare, we recall, is equivalent to social surplus, which is the sum of consumer and producer surplus. When market failure occurs, allocative efficiency is not reached, because allocative efficiency is when social surplus is maximized. So governments are trying to achieve allocative efficiency. Promoting equity, so that's the idea that everyone has the same outcome. So income equity, income equality, etc., promoting those ideas. So intervention could be in the labor market. So for instance, a minimum wage is a price floor. Yeah, minimum wage is a price floor, and we'll get to that later, but that helps reduce income inequalities and promote equity. Main forms of government intervention: price controls. So price controls, like we said, like I was just talking about, there are price ceilings and price floors, and we have to know how to draw diagrams of these and the various impacts on stakeholders. So let's draw some diagrams. Here I have the standard demand and supply diagram with market equilibrium being here. We'll call that level E1. And since this is intervention, we cannot have equilibrium. That's the point of intervention, right? And when you intervene in a market, the market will normally, without intervention, be at equilibrium. But that equilibrium may not be optimal for certain stakeholders. Say in the labor market, if we have labor equilibrium levels of labor, what would happen is there will be no unemployment at all in the economy, which seems like a good thing. But the problem is, at that level of wage where there's no unemployment at all, in Australia, the minimum wage is $19.49 an hour. This could fall down to about $10 an hour, which is not good. That's why in Australia and many other countries, you have a minimum wage, which is a price floor. And when you think of floor, you generally think bottom, but don't make the mistake of putting it below equilibrium. We're trying to prevent equilibrium. So we're going to put a price floor above equilibrium price. So I'm going to call this PF for price floor. Similarly, a price ceiling is a maximum price, so we cannot go beyond it. So we're going to put the price ceiling over there, below equilibrium. Price ceilings are present in rent control, so renting and housing costs. Generally, they tend to be very large if you don't have price control, so price ceilings are kind of justified. But let's have a look at the impacts of a price floor and price ceiling. So if you have a price ceiling, what happens is you have this much, you have a lower price than equilibrium. At a lower price than equilibrium, there'll be less quantity supplied, because at a lower price, quantity supplied decreases. But there'll be higher quantity demanded, because as price decreases, QD increases. So due to a price ceiling, we actually have a shortage where quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied. Shortage means that some people completely miss out. That's why rent controls are sometimes argued against in certain countries, because it can lead to housing shortages. But other indirect impacts could be that there could be a black market for housing. So a black market, or a parallel market, sometimes it's called parallel underground markets, or an informal market where on paper for the government, people may report that rent is paid at, let's say price ceiling is $400 a week. They could say on paper it's $400 a week, but in reality, they negotiate with the buyer and actually charge $500. Technically, it's not disobeying the legal price ceiling, but they are doing it inadvertently, and that goes against the notions of what the price ceiling here is trying to achieve. And same for a price floor. You can undersell things, but that won't really occur, because in a price floor, what happens is you have surplus because quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Because of the surplus, there's a lot that's not sold, and actually, if you don't sell everything and you cannot go below this price, what some firms will do is they will also resort to an underground parallel market and sell the excess there. In terms of the shortage here, with the price ceiling, generally the government may try to subsidize firms, or form other kind of intervention in accordance with the price ceiling, in order to avoid some people completely missing out on something essential like housing. But another consequence that can possibly occur is when you have a price ceiling implemented, it could lead to the maximum price being too low for landlords to think, I want to take good quality care of my housing that I provide for my tenants. So what they might do is have low quality housing. So the quality of housing itself may decrease in the market. So price may be charged at $400 a week at max, but maybe that the quality of housing will fall down a lot. There may not be repairs, there not be those things done, because landlords may find those things to be unprofitable if they do that, because $400 may be too low for them. So it can lead to consequences for consumers, in the form that some of them completely miss out, and the other one that some of the quality may fall. And also because of this, tenants also miss out. Landlords miss out, because they of course have to charge a lower price than they could earlier, so that's bad for them. In terms of price floor, you have greater quantity supplied than quantity demanded, so surplus. So what happens is sellers benefit initially, because they can sell more than sell at a higher price than equilibrium, so they can earn revenue that way. But the problem is that some sellers don't actually sell their product because there's a surplus, so some of them miss out. But generally the government may try to buy the excess supply, so the sellers may actually in fact gain that revenue. They won't actually have the surplus in reality, because the government may want to put the price floor in effect, and they might buy the excess supply, if you guys get that. All right, those are the main key points for the consequences on stakeholders. You can also analyze consumer surplus, producer surplus, etc. So if I was going to do producer surplus for the price floor, it would actually be this whole area, right? Consumer surplus would be this area, right? Whereas previously it would have been this area for consumer surplus. This area would have been consumer surplus. This area, at equilibrium, that is. But those are changed. And I want you to try to do some highlighting. Take a screenshot of this and this diagram, and then highlight the new producer surplus and consumer surplus for a price ceiling compared to the equilibrium price. And also, by the way, when I highlighted producer surplus, I did this. So this extra bit here that I highlighted, that's for a reason, because this surplus here is bought by the government generally. So that's the reason I highlighted it. It's not a mistake, I don't think. Yeah, so price ceiling max, price floor minimum, we got that. Next, we're going to look at indirect taxes and subsidies. And indirect tax is a tax on goods and services, a good or service. So in Australia, we have GST. In UK, I believe they have VAT. You can see that a lot in many textbooks. They mention VAT. So again, standard demand and supply curve, supply, demand, And what does the tax do? An indirect tax, it's actually charged on producers. So it's just that the 10% we pay extra as consumers is because that burden is passed on to us as consumers. So a tax, as we know with the non-price determinants of supply, decrease supply. So supply curve shifts left from S1 to S2, and initial equilibrium would have been E1 here, and it would be E2. So you can see quantity has fallen, price has increased. So we can see that it's bad for consumers, right? And even producers, it's bad because they don't actually receive this higher price. They're just passing on the burden to consumers. They're passing on some of the burden. And in terms of tax burden, we can draw out the tax burden. Whoops, I did that wrong. Yeah, so if you want to calculate tax burden, you got to go down from the new equilibrium and go to the right, and you go from the previous equilibrium to here, and you go up here. So what this is representing is, first of all, so let's call this P3, this P2, P1. So P2 would have been the first equilibrium price that consumers paid, right? Consumers would have paid that amount, but now they are paying P3, so there's a price increase. So because the price is increased by P2 to P3, for consumers, we call that the consumer burden. And consumer burden represents the loss of welfare for consumers. Next, we have price is P2 initially, that consumers pay and also producers receive. But with the tax, you may seem like producers are gaining P3 price, but that's not true. That's the value with the tax. We got to go down to the old supply curve to work out the actual price that producers receive, which in this case is P1. P1, since price has gone down from P2 to P1, that's the producer burden. And what's cool about this is when you compare elasticities, elasticity will actually affect tax burden. So I guess that might be in another understanding, so we won't go over that here. But you may realize that there's actually, so initial consumer surplus, let me just draw from here. This might be getting a bit technical. So initial consumer surplus would have been like that. Initial producer surplus would have been like that, right? Now, what happened to this other area? That other area is the deadweight loss. So that deadweight loss is something that's not gained by anyone and that's completely lost and made useless, utterly redundant. Now you may think, what about this area? Wasn't this area made redundant? Well, no, because when suppliers sell QE2 of quantity at the new equilibrium price, they sell at P1. They receive P1, but they sell at P3. So who gets this extra bit? The government does. This area here, consumer burden and producer burden, is government revenue. Now, in terms of subsidy, it's a bit like the opposite, right? First of all, there's direct provision of services, and direct provision of services is basically like a subsidy, but you just increase supply by directly providing instead of lowering costs of production. So if you have P, Q, S1, D1, you have S2, right? This could be a subsidy, or this could be due to subsidy, or this could be due to direct provision. So a subsidy would lower cost of production at every given price level or price. Producers would produce a higher quantity, so S would increase from S1 to S2, and direct provision would affect it like that. But also, direct provision would mean that at every given price, there'll be more quantity supplied, so there's a higher supply overall. Now, if we look here, this is E1, this is E2. Now, we don't call this burden anymore because consumers and producers, they're not going to be burdened by this. Producers, for one, they receive a better price, right? A better price. And consumers, they receive a better price as well, at a lower price. Who pays that extra amount of the subsidy? The government does. So P3, P2, P1. Okay, and don't use these labels. Use like PE1 for this one and QE1 here. and QE2 here. I'm just using this for the purpose of this demonstration. So we have consumers initially paying P1 and P2, and now they pay P1, right? So since they pay a lower amount, we have an increase in consumer surplus, which is this area right here, right? Below the demand curve, above the equilibrium price line. So previously would have been only this amount, right? Now we've actually gained more because of the lower price. Similarly, the producers, even though consumers buy at P1, the actual non-subsidized price is P3. So the subsidy is what lowers it, but they receive P3. P3 is what they receive. The government pays the subsidy. So even though they sell at P1, they're essentially selling at P3. So because they sell at P3 instead of P2, their producer surplus is going to increase, right? Producer surplus increases by this amount. So one thing to note is the sides are flipped around. So that's something you need to be careful when you draw the diagrams and analyze them. Whether it's paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, most likely paper 1 or 3. But this whole area here is going to be government expenditure, because the gaps between the supply curves, right? I forgot to mention this for taxes. That's the tax per unit. This is the subsidy per unit, right? For the QE2 units, for each unit, the government pays SPU, which is subsidy per unit, right? And because it pays for QE2 units, this whole rectangle is going to be the area of government expenditure. And what you may realize is this gap right here, this triangle, that's also going to no one. The government spends on it. The government expenditure is included there, but no one actually gains that welfare, and that is deadweight loss. So that also leads to market failure. That's why indirect taxes and subsidies can sometimes lead to market failure, but that's not always the case in terms of externalities. So we'll look into that later. Command and control legislation. Generally, command and control regulation and legislation, sorry, I'm stumbling on my words, is direct laws that prevent or hinder or control a production or consumption activity. So one thing could be on cigarettes. No smoking in public spaces would be able to reduce consumption of cigarettes. Carbon cap emissions on caps on carbon emissions could reduce carbon-based production, so its supply decreases. So that really is dependent on what case you're looking at. Consumer nudges, we remember in our summary of unit 1? Yeah, unit 1, Introduction to Economics, we looked at behavioral economics. We looked at consumer nudges, where you can frame a choice and manipulate choice architecture in such a way that you affect consumption levels. So one example we looked at was cigarettes, how they have quite vulgar images on their covers to deter people from smoking, because they think this might happen to me if I continue smoking. So that would decrease demand for cigarettes. Similarly, you can have consumer nudges in terms of advertisements, or you can change choice architecture, like mandated default choice, like the organ donor example I gave earlier. So that way, it's really up to the scenario to determine which way the supply or demand curve will shift. But one thing to note is that consumer nudges will generally affect demand, right? I'm not sure, you can have nudges for supply, but I think just focus on demand for IB. We have looked at the diagrams for indirect taxes and subsidies, and we did look at the effect on stakeholders for these. So there we go. Government intervention markets, we talked about the consequences as well. Now, socially optimal level of output is where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. Now, you probably have no idea what that means. Well, let me tell you. Marginal social benefit is just a fancy word for the supply curve. So remember how we talked about earlier how the supply curve is the marginal cost curve, and the the demand curve is the marginal benefit curve, and the reasons for that are quite complicated, and that's not really assessed in the syllabus so much, But if you guys want to see a video on that, do let me know. But we can write the supply curve as the marginal social benefit curve, right? And the marginal social cost curve. Oops, dropped my stylus. Bit shaky today. Marginal social benefit. And there's a difference between marginal social benefit and something we call marginal private benefit, right? So private benefit is the benefit for an individual, right? An individual performing an activity. So marginal private benefit would be for the demand curve. Say if one person smokes, right, they gain marginal private benefit because they get a benefit for themselves, which could be the nicotine hit. Marginal social cost, maybe sorry, I shouldn't mention marginal social benefit versus marginal private benefit. Actually, let's go into externalities first. So one thing we need to note, let's just forget about marginal private stuff. All right, private is individual, but we won't worry about that yet. Sorry about that. So we have marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. Where those two are equal is where allocative efficiency occurs. So in a market where there's no externalities, we'll get into what externalities are later. In a market where there are no externalities, when the supply and demand curves intersect, that's going to be where MSC, supply, equals MSB, demand. And that point we know is equilibrium, right? And equilibrium, social welfare is going to be maximized. And we have allocative efficiency, as that syllabus point says. However, this is not always the case. The key thing to note is that as economic agents, we only consider about ourselves. We're quite selfish. We only consider our private benefit and private costs when we produce. So technically, we have this assumption going on. We assume that the marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit and marginal social cost equals marginal private cost. And because consumption activity occurs where based on MPC, not MSC, and MPB, not MSB, we're going to have equilibrium where MPB equals MPC. Okay, hear me out. So this is what allocative efficiency is, when this one MSB equals MSC, but equilibrium will actually be where MPC equals MPB, because people are selfish and they only consider their own private costs and benefits. Now here we assume that in a market where there are no externalities, MSB will equal MPB, MSC equals MPC. But you can have externalities. What is an externality, you may ask? Well, externality is a third-party benefit or consequence based on an economic activity conducted by other stakeholders. So a more specific definition, we'll look at positive externalities of production and consumption. So when you think about externality, think about someone that's not involved in an economic activity and they're somehow impacted. So let's say of consumption, right? So if you have someone smoking a cigarette, there could be someone else walking by and they're negatively affected because their health is negatively affected from secondhand smoking. That's a negative externality of the person consuming it. So that's a negative externality of consumption, right? And let's say carbon emissions, right? So let's say there's a factory producing lots of carbon emissions. Their marginal private costs would only consider how much money they take in order to buy their factor inputs and produce their outputs. However, they're producing carbon emissions. These carbon emissions will cause global warming and as a result affect the sustainability for everyone in society. So that's a social cost, right? So that's a negative externality of production. So a negative externality, we're going to work out first. Negative externality is a third-party consequence on stakeholders not involved in economic activity. So think about someone that's not actually participating in the supply and demand, but is actually affected. And negative externalities of production will be based on marginal social cost, and consumption will be marginal social benefit. And positive externalities of production will also be affecting the supply curve, or MSC, and product consumption will be MSB, right? Now you may ask, how do negative externalities actually affect these curves? So let's look at negative externalities of consumption first, right? So remember how I said we need to assume that for equilibrium to exist, marginal private cost equals marginal private benefit. Well, let's say the demand curve is marginal private benefit, okay? Now, let's say we're talking about smoking. When someone smokes, they negatively impact others around them, so society is worse off. So what happens is marginal social benefit is actually less than the marginal private benefit. See how this is to the left? Now, don't get me wrong. If when we're analyzing negative externalities of consumption, we got to assume that there are no externalities in production generally. So we can assume that MSC equals MPC as we assume when there are no externalities. So here, this is where equilibrium of the free market. In a free market, we only consider about ourselves. We operate at MPB equals MPC, which in this case is also equal to MSC. But what happens is MSB equals MSC is at this point. This is the E social optimum. Now we have overproduction because Q social optimum, quantity of social optimum, is actually less than quantity of the free market. So the free market allocates too much. So too much consumption activity happens, which is why you generally have consumer nudges, etc., that deter consumption and actually shift this demand curve to the left so that MPB can equal MSB and we can have allocative efficiency, right? Allocative efficiency, MSB equals MSC. That's all good. Now the problem is because we have overconsumption, for every unit beyond QSE, notice how this is the marginal. So let's say for this unit right here, some quantity here, right? This is the marginal social benefit. This is the marginal social cost. So there's this, society's worse off by this much. For this point, society's worse off by this much, this much. So society's worse off by this much. We call that the welfare loss. And always when we look at the welfare loss triangle always points at the Q socially optimum. It's meant to be an E. Q socially optimum is always pointed at by the welfare loss triangle. So that's something you need to remember. Now let's say we have a negative externality of production, right? So for every production activity of carbon, society's more worse off, and social optimum is going to be somewhere else. So first of all, when you do externalities, you're going to find the free market. MPB equals MPC. We have EFM. Now, since there are negative externalities of production, what happens is the marginal social cost is higher than the marginal private cost. So supply curve shows, you can generally think of it as an increase in the supply, but that might confuse you. So just take that with a grain of salt. So supply curve is actually to the right, the actual marginal social cost. Now what happens? Marginal social cost is higher. Marginal social cost is higher. I just realized I drew that wrong. That's marginal social cost is lower. Marginal social cost is higher. My bad. Marginal social cost is higher, MSC. Right? Because MSC is higher, this is where MSB equals MSC. So this is socially optimum level. Right? We can do QSO and this is QFM. Right? Should probably put a 2 there. So that's the free market. This is the socially optimum, and for every unit consumed above QSO and up to QFM, we actually incur a welfare loss. So that's the welfare loss, right? Again, it's pointing at the socially optimal level. What can the government do? Well, they can tackle it by implementing some form that supplies this, some form of intervention that changes this supply curve to equal this supply curve. And what do we know? The government can increase taxation or provide an indirect tax, which will shift supply curve from S1 to S2, correcting market failure and having allocative efficiency. What you realize now is that when the case of negative externalities of production and consumption, we have an overproduction of something. So there's an over allocation of resources. That's something you need to note down, because when we look at over allocation of resources, right, allocative efficiency, that really determines what policies we need to do. We need to undertake as the government to correct the market failure. So we've done negative externalities of production and consumption. And the weird thing is the syllabus point has positive first before negative, but like here in the diagrams, it's easy to learn negative before positive, but it's just, it might be personal preference. Yeah, so you have welfare loss, and you can correct that by making MPC equal MSC, which can be done also through reduction in subsidies or command and control approaches like we discussed earlier. Generally, you won't look at price controls for externalities, so don't associate those two together. So again, we have a free market level here, and where MPC equals MPB at EFM. Let's say we have positive externalities of production in this case. What that means is there are spillover benefits on consumers. Sorry, let me define a positive externality of production. Positive externalities of production are spillover benefits on third parties not involved in a production activity. So one such example is education, right? So you have suppliers of education who will supply education at a certain cost, like schools will incur a certain cost. But what happens is education has all these positive externalities of well, you could say production, but you can have consumption as well. We look at it just education for both production and consumption. Don't get confused. So if you produce education, what happens is people will learn, and people who learn will learn new skills, and these people, when they enter the workforce in society, they're going to be more productive because they have better skills, better human capital. And because of this, society is better off, and marginal social cost will actually be less than the marginal private cost. So MSC would be something like this. We can call that S2, right? So this is going to be where, again, since we're looking at production side, we've got to assume that the demand side is, or the consumption side is, it doesn't have any externalities at all. So MPB equals MSB. So this is going to be socially optimum, and this is QSO, Q socially optimum, and this is QFM. And as you can see, QFM is lower than QSO, so there's an under allocation. And for each unit below QSO and above QFM, we have potential welfare that we could have had, but that's foregone. So for this point, MSB would have been here, MSC would have been here. So this would have been the benefit foregone. This would have been benefit foregone for these levels of production all the way up to here. So we get this triangle, again pointing at social optimum. That's the potential welfare gain, right? Now let's take a look at positive externalities of production. Sorry, there was a plane outside. It was very noisy. Alright, so positive externalities of consumption. Now, since we're looking at consumption, we've got to assume that there are no externalities on the supply side. So MPC equals MSC, demand equals MPB. So MPB equals MSC we have here, so EFM. And what happens is we assume that, let's say, consumption or education. I'm just telling you this because not to confuse you with the fact that education can be both the production side and consumption side a positive externality. I'm doing this because it's not always a black and white thing with economics. Sometimes you can have things with positive externalities of production and consumption, like education, right? I'm teaching you this because not to get confused in certain situations, but generally in an exam there'll only be one side to look at, so don't look at both sides. Don't ever shift like two curves. Don't ever have two curves shifted in an exam. So like I remember in, I think, grade 11 or grade 12, I think early grade 12, I had we had an exam where they had some people confuse a production side positive externality and a consumption side, and it was meant to be consumption side. So yeah, be wary of that. Sorry to go on a tangent. So we have education. So when you consume education, you get that private benefit, right? So you can be hired for a higher wage, right? Because when you're educated, you have opportunities for higher paid jobs. So that's your private benefit. And the social benefit, the externality, is going to be for society, right? Society has higher skilled workers, more productive workers. Society is going to be able to produce more output. That's the benefit for society. So marginal social benefit is going to be above marginal private benefit. So we have D2 equals MSB, right? So here we have MSC equals MSB ESO. QFM is lower than QSO, and for each unit we're foregoing that much. That's the potential welfare gain, right? That's again the deadweight loss. Another thing I want to mention is that these distances between the curves that we change or are separated, so where MS something is not equal to MP something, that distance there is the actual value of the externality. Okay, so earlier for the supply curves, this would have been the value of the positive externality. Anyways, the reason I didn't mention the policies that you could undertake for positive externalities of production, I want you guys to think about that on your own, and also the positive externalities of consumption right here. I want you to think about policies that can shift this demand curve to the right, to this demand equal to curve, which is MSB. Think about that. And these goods which have positive externalities of consumption, we call them merit goods. By the way, when it says welfare loss, that's also potential welfare gain. That's also equal to welfare loss. It's just I prefer, because the way I was taught was we call this potential welfare gain because we could have gained that amount, but we didn't. But that is still a loss to society, because if you could have gained it, that is still a loss if you don't gain it at all. So we got these diagrams nailed, and we have calculated welfare loss. Demerit goods are goods which have negative externalities of consumption. So merit and demerit are consumption side. So, and when you think about merits and demerits, you can think about like your license, demerit points, and merit, like something is good, that's applauded. So you can think about positive for merit, demerit. And common pool resources. So common pool resources are types of resources which have two characteristics. So they are rivalrous, meaning consumption by one party reduces the amount available for another. So an example of common pool, and before that, another characteristic is that they are non-excludable. So non-excludable. Non-excludable means that people cannot be excluded from it just because they don't pay. Right, so this could be fish in a lake as an example, right? So if a fish in a lake, if there's no laws against fishing in that lake, well, anyone can go there. They don't have to pay a price. So it's non-excludable. That's but it's rivalrous, because if one person goes fishing for like 10 fish versus another 1,000, right? Another person who goes for 1,000, that's going to reduce the amount of fish in that lake for others. And what this leads to is the tragedy of commons. Tragedy of commons is the idea that common pool resources will be depleted because everyone has an incentive to look out for their own benefits, right? So if some guy, is going to be fishing for like thousands of fish, you have your own incentive to catch as many fish as possible. However, like everyone's intentions may be not well, because in the long run, if you fish too much, this fish stock is going to deplete, and that's going to lead to no fish being there for anyone. So it's worse off for everyone. But if you can't control or stop others from exploiting a resource, you have your incentive to exploit the resource yourself, and that's what leads to unsustainable production. And the effect of common pool resources is negative externalities of production. So if you use a common pool resource like the lake, if you produce fish too much based on it, you're going to have the future generations face a negative externality because they may not have enough fish for them. So that's the negative externality associated with it, and it leads to unsustainable production. Government intervention in response to common pool resources and externalities. We looked at this again. So Pigovian taxes are indirect taxes on a demerit good or something that has negative externalities of consumption, I believe. Carbon taxes are specifically taxes on carbon-based production. So carbon taxes would decrease supply on carbon-based production. And again, you know how to draw those. Legislation and regulation, like I said earlier, how you have command and control methods, they can affect production or supply in various ways. So there's no one right answer. There's no one way you can think about it. So don't try to memorize one way. It can shift both supply or demand. Education, awareness creation. When you have educational awareness creation, where you let people know about the social effects of their private consumption activities. So what happens in turn is that people are more likely to follow through in a way that benefits society. Because like I said, even though I said people are selfish, they may be selfish because they don't know how much society is worse off or better off with their activities, right? Tradable permits for carbon taxes are like allowances on how much, maybe allowances is a bad word, but how much carbon you're allowed to or permitted to emit. So if you have like 50 gigatons of carbon that you're allowed to emit, that's how much you can legally emit. So you have an incentive to cut down how much carbon you produce, and this leads to a decrease in supply generally. And tradable permits have lots of evaluation points for your Part Bs and Part Gs in Paper 2. We'll go into that later. International agreements, this is for common pool resources like fish maybe in the ocean, and international agreements are agreements between countries to follow a certain protocol when consuming or producing something. Collective self-governance is specifically for common pool resources where the uses of the resource come together, communicate, and realize that we should set aside some rules so that we're all better off. Like in the fish example, they're all worse off if they all overfish. So they decide to put a quota on maximum amount of fish so that they all have fish stock for future generations. Subsidies, increased supply, government provision, increased supply. We know how these work, we just discussed them. Strengths and limitations of policies. So one of the main issues is a negative externality or positive externality, whatever the value of the externality, which is the difference between the curves, like the vertical distance. It's hard to measure that in real life or provide a monetary value to it. So oftentimes it'll be difficult to know how much exactly to shift the curves. So there might be overshifting or undershifting, and that will lead to inability to achieve allocative efficiency. So measuring the externality is a difficult part. Degree of effectiveness is whether it's going to be effective or not in terms of how much I can implement it. So in terms of the command and control approach, where you have collective self-governance, how well are the laws enforced? Are there punishments in place to prevent people or like stop people from actually going against protocol? Consequences for stakeholders like welfare parts. I recommend you guys do that on your own because I will explain it, but it's just the standard things we've explained already. Just draw out the diagrams and consider how each party is affected. Importance of international cooperation, global nature, sustainability issues. That's the idea that most of the sustainable resources are shared internationally, so international efforts need to be made or pursued in order for actual good change to be made. Challenges faced in international cooperation, so different laws and different countries may be committing more towards resource than others. So if you have the ocean and fish stock, right, some countries may be overfishing more than others. So if you set a maximum level of how much fishing you can do, there are questions, political questions asked about what that max should be. Monitoring enforcement, so who's going to enforce those laws? Are there going to be biases? How can we make sure people don't go against, like, go undercover and make those choices? Public goods are another type of good which are non-rivalrous, so you cannot, so consumption by one party does not lead to consumption by does not lead to lowered ability for others to consume. So an example of this would be a street light. Just because a street light is in front of your house and you consume it doesn't mean that others can't consume the benefits of the street light, which is better lit roads, right? Same with a public park to a lesser extent. Like if it's large enough, then you can stay on the park without bothering others or taking away others' ability to be in the park. Actually, a better example is Netflix, right? Netflix is non-rivalrous. Of course, it is excludable because you have to pay for the membership. It's non-rivalrous because you can have millions of people using Netflix. It doesn't take away your ability. Just because millions are watching with you at the same time doesn't mean your ability to watch is reduced. Non-excludable means that, like I said earlier, you cannot exclude people who don't pay for it. So like a public park, it's free, right? Now, because it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable, what happens is, because you can't stop people who don't pay for it from consuming the product, what happens is there's the free rider problem. People use something without paying for it. And because of this, producers don't actually produce these goods because they don't see any reason to, because public goods are not going to be able to, the producers are not going to be able to profit from them. So governments have to produce public goods. And the way I remember this is public, you think about public sector, the government, public goods, the government has to produce. They're produced by direct provision, they make it themselves. That's why public parks are run by the government. Contracting out to the private sector. So sometimes they can send it to the private sector by Generally, the government will initiate the project, so they might start the public parks and then give it to the private sector to continue. And there are other types of market failure. These are new syllabus points. It's HL. We have asymmetric information, which is when one party has more information than the others in an economic activity. Actually, for asymmetric information and yeah, so rational producer, yeah. So we're up to the end of microeconomics. I might make that a part 3 just because this is going on for more than 45 minutes. I generally don't want to make my videos more than 45 minutes long because I feel like in terms of attention span, it's not good for you guys. Plus for me, it gets kind of hard after recording for 45 minutes plus the editing. So if you guys did enjoy this video, I know I started a bit, but like always, it's hard to cover. I think you're given like 20 hours of teaching time or even more than that. Yeah, you're given like 50 or 60 hours of teaching time for microeconomics, but I'm trying to cover it in like under an hour, under like 4 hours in total. So if you guys do appreciate that, please don't forget to like, comment down below any feedback you have, any topics you want me to cover urgently. And as always, support the channel by subscribing. I'll be also doing a giveaway at 50 subscribers, so look forward to that. Other than that, see you guys in a future video. Peace out.